Right, what have I got today? Bush. Well, it's another beam versus beam video, and the reason I'm making this is I've had quite a few comments from people through the channel anyway, wanting a direct comparison. So although I have obviously discussed, especially when I did the mini one by Jetbeam here, I'd certainly discussed this and one of the Royvon. So if you want to go and see the review for either this one or this one, you can go and do that now. I'll put the links down in the description. But getting on with this, because I'm going to try and make this rapid and straight to the point. So it's a direct comparison between the Nightcore TIKI, and it's the glow-in-the-dark version. The glow-in-the-dark version is exactly the same as the non-glow-in-the-dark version, other than obviously the polycarbonate shell is glow-in-the-dark in this version, which matches in line with the specs of the Jetbeam Mini one. They're both glow-in-the-dark. In regards to that, they don't glow for very long, 3 minutes and they're done basically, and then there's a little bit of residual glow there. It's disappointing, but they're not using the expensive chemicals to do that. But to be fair, this is a keychain light, and to keep costs down, they've probably decided we'll use the cheap chemical, so it glows for a little bit but not very long. A little bit disappointing, but in direct comparison you could say, well, both suffer from that. So what can you do? So like I say, full description of these is this is the Nitcore TIKI glow-in-the-dark version, and this is the Jetbeam Mini 1 SE. The SE has the glow-in-the-dark, the non-SE seems to have like almost like a metallic shell. I don't have that, but we're going to go off this one for this review. Okay, so what are the max outputs on these lights? Well, the Nitcore TIKI has a max output of 300 lumens, so you can get directly to that obviously by just holding it down. So there's your 300 lumens. Now it's beaten by the Jetbeam here. The Jetbeam goes straight up to 500 lumens. Now that's obviously better, but the obvious issue is they have a similar sized battery. Even though they physically look slightly different, this one's a little bit fatter. That just happens to be longer and slimmer. They're around 120 milliamp hours, and they're both lithium ion chemistries. So that ain't going to last as long, but it certainly gives you a bigger blast when you need it. So that you can argue that's a plus point, especially for an EDC. In other words, it's always on your keys. Like I say, they're both glow in the dark, but nothing to write home about. They both have a UV mode. Now, if I can remember rightly, I think it's triple click, is it? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so even though that looks green, probably there is a bit of UV there. If I've got something white, it'll probably show up. You see how that's showing up blue? So that is, and I think they're 300 and something like 400 to 365 nanometers wavelength of light coming from both of them. So that one is, you can go straight to it there. And on this one, I think it's a triple click as well, or double. Triple, yeah, triple. And again, that might look green there. It does, because it's coming through this glow-in-the-dark shell. But when you put it on something which is reactive to UV light, you can see that is blue. So they both have that feature, both using similar wavelength of light. It seems slightly brighter on this, but it's not a deal breaker. They're very similar in function, I would argue. Okay, so what about secondary modes? Because obviously you've got your main light here, which are different emitters, which I will go over them. But in regards to your extra emitters here, on this one, on the Jetbeam, you have like a multi-emitter here. Now it's almost segmented. It's hard to see. That one on the left is segmented, and it does red, green and blue. And then the one on the far right is a UV only. So you have all these extra modes. Now the extra modes are different on the TIKI. So you have a UV one, and then you also have a high CRI. So you know what the UV one is. There's the UV. Now if we click this will change the high CRI. Now high CRI just means color rendering index. So you're going to get, I think it's about 90% plus color rendering you're going to get. So what you'll find with a lot of LEDs, especially the high output ones anyway, you don't get a particularly good color rendering. Now unless you're a photographer or you're a bit of a snob, it's not really going to matter to most people. But it's nice to have that option, and it's especially nice when you're working and you're working with colors and you want a nice reproduction of the surroundings. You don't get that with this. Now I would argue that maybe the extra features are better on the TIKI, because think about it, you've got a UV, so is this, and you've got a high CRI. On this you have loads of different colors that you may not really want. You've got your main beam, but then if you go to this, you've got, if I remember how to get to it, there you've got your red, green and blue there, and then you click and hold, and then it flashes through them a different way. And then you've got like a marker mode in red, and it goes to, and then you've got, you could argue there's there's good points and bad points for each. I would possibly argue that feature set might be better for some, whereas that might be better for some. If you're more interested in markers, that's probably more interesting. You can still, there are marker modes for this, but they're different and you're not getting the colours. So, but do you really need those colours? You know, that's something you need to think about. Okay, so buttons, slightly different. The Nightcore is larger and it's tougher. Now it's harder to hold down. It's more irritating to hold that down. You've got to use quite a lot of pressure than it is on this. Now, is that a good point or a bad point? Well, it's irritating. However, it prevents that being pressed on. Or look, imagine this is in your pocket. This is the Nightcore and it gets pressed on. It's harder to press that on by accident. Whereas this, it takes a very light touch. I'm just using a fingernail here, you see. Very easy to turn that on. Although, you could argue that this has an E-lockout, whereas that doesn't. Now, I'll quickly show you that. I'm trying to make this rapid, but the E-lockout on this, I found poor. This is how you've got to do it. Okay, so to get to E-lockout, which prevents it from functioning, you've got to go 1, 2, 3 into UV mode. Then you've got to hold this button down for 8 seconds and wait for a flash. Okay, so keep waiting. There's the flash. Now it's in lockout mode, so it won't function, so it's safe in your pocket no matter what. But to get out of that, you've got to hold this down for 4 seconds. I mean, who's got time for all that? You could argue that this is better. If the button just presses, nothing happens, okay? Yes, albeit it does if you hold it down for turbo, but in normal function, if you just knock it, it isn't going to turn on by accident, whereas this can, okay? However, to get around that, they've just had a double press for the mode, so double press. You're less likely to do a double press in the pockets by accident than you are a single press. I would possibly agree with that. That's fair enough, and these will cut out after sort of 30 seconds if you put them on turbo, so that only lasts a certain amount of time. So if it does automatically knock on, it'll knock off. So you've got to ask yourself, do you need E-lockout? I suppose the only way to answer that is how tight are your trousers? If you have very tight trousers, you're probably going to knock this on more often, or if you have a lot of things in your pocket. So you need to think about that. But the lockout on this, who's going to bother with all that? You know, triple click this, double click that, hold that for 8 seconds, you know, sit around making a cup of tea. Life's too short for all that, I think, but E-lockout is on there if you want it. Okay, so let's talk about flaps. Now, although that might sound a little bit rude, it isn't. So looking at the flap for charging on the Mini one, it's pretty poor. Look, it doesn't go in very deep, and I'll show you. So we'll pull that out a bit. Can you see the depth on that? It's not particularly great, is it? It's very shallow. And this sort of flaps around. They're never that good, these flaps, but compare that to the Nightcore. I would say the Nightcore's better. Look, it's harder to knock out because it's underneath, and then look, it seems to have a bit more depth. I find that seats slightly better, slightly, you know, than this, although this seems to fit tighter. So they're both not particularly amazing, but I would say the Nightcore's slightly better, very, very slightly. You know, it all comes down to, do you trust these flaps? I mean, to be fair, the Nightcore only claims IPX6, whereas the Jetbeam's claiming IPX8. I would doubt this is IPX8 if this is even remotely unseated. Water is going to get in there, unfortunately. You know, whereas at least they've been a little bit more honest on the Tiki here. But like I say, that fits slightly better, but your mileage may vary, and a lot of people would argue, who cares? These are going to be on a set of keys. How often do you dunk your set of keys in a swimming pool? Hardly ever. Or, you know, jump off a huge waterfall like Arnie does in Predator. Probably not very often, but it's nice to have that feature. It gives you a bit more guarantee that this is going to work when you need it. Okay, so both the flaps are a bit feeble, and I've talked about the IPXs. So what about the main emitters? Now, they're both behind a TIR. So the one on the right here, in fact, I'll swap them around so it's always on the left. Tiki on the left, Jetbeam on the right. So you can see very, very similar. They're both behind a TIR, which is a sensible choice because you're going to get a nice floody beam up close. They're not meant for firing the light out. Although you can fire out about similar amount, even though you get more output from the Jetbeam. They both seem to travel a very similar distance anyway. Now, the Nightcore uses a Osram P8, and the Jetbeam uses an older, it's the Cree XPG3. Now, I'm going to put these down for a second, because what I want to talk about is the slight differences in how they look. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up some pictures. So obviously this is the Tiki. and this is the Jetbeam. So I'll bring some pictures up here, right? So as you can see in these pictures, on the left here, you've got the Nightcore TIKI. Now what I did was, this isn't photography. I did one film in 4K with exactly the same settings, one continuous shot. I didn't adjust any settings. And it was exactly the same position, and I held the light at the same position and the same angle and everything. I tried my absolute best to be as fair as possible. Now, as you can see, I would argue that the Tiki has a more saturated look. I don't know if it's a better colour rendering index. It might be slightly better. It certainly looks better to the eye. However, you can see that the Jetbeam on the right here is certainly lighter. It's a lot lighter because you're getting, you know, more lumens, 300 lumens on the Tiki as opposed to 500. It's much brighter. Distance-wise, there doesn't seem to be a lot in it, really, does there? I mean, you can zoom in if you want it. In fact, I'll do some zooms there. There you go. There's some zooms so you can see that if there's any differences. I was firing this across a field. There's not a lot of difference in how far they're going, but I would argue it's certainly brighter on the Mini one. So that, anyway, well, let's get rid of them. Boosh. There you go. That gets rid of them. Okay. So batteries, like I say, they're both around 120 milliamp hours. You're going to get similar amount of juice in there, although runtimes will differ because of the outputs. And in regards to outputs, they both go from 1 lumen all the way up to the maximum, which is great. So you've got 1 lumen there if you want it. This one goes up to 1 lumen to 300, and this 100 to 500 in different steps. Now, the only difference is in connections. This uses, which is the Tiki here, this uses the old-fashioned micro USB. Can you see that? Now that means you've got to have it the right way up, so you have to have the orientation right. There's an old-fashioned micro USB there, so it has to be the right way up, otherwise it's not going to work. That functions exactly the same as a Type C, but Type C is, you can put it that way or that way, it's irrelevant. Now I would argue that I prefer the Type C, which is a more modern interface. Times have moved on, it's now 2021. So there's the Type C on the Mini one. I prefer that. I don't have to muck about. You just plug it in. You just get your cable and you plug it in like that. No messing. Done. Dead simple. Whereas on one of these, you're fiddling and you go, oh, I've got it the wrong way around, right? Let's turn it around. Oh, it's not going in. Come on, Nightcore. You know, time's getting on. Really, all lights from now on should be using Type C, but that's just my opinion there. And in regards to the cables, they both work whilst plugged in, which is a nice feature. So there's nothing to differentiate between the two of them there. So what else can we say? They both work well charged, and you know, you've got the differences in the micro USB. Let's think about some good and bad points. So you've got a high CRI mode on here. Whether you need that or not is another matter. Lockout, you could argue, isn't needed because you've got to go for a double press to go through the modes. Fair enough, that's true. Whereas this, you can probably knock on quite easily, and the button's quite soft. You would have thought they'd made the button harder on this, but they would probably argue, well, we have a lockout and they don't. Yes, you do, but it's tedious to get to and it's tedious to use, and I don't like that. But obviously, this is Type C, which is much more modern interface, and it's brighter, a lot brighter, hundreds of lumens brighter. So the question is, which is best? Now, I've carried the non-glow-in-the-dark version of this for some period of time. I love the Tiki. I think it's a fantastic light, brilliant for a keychain light. So the question is, am I going to swap to this? I think possibly. The only thing that's put me off is I wouldn't want this going off by accident like that and then running in the pocket and running down. I can see that happening if I'm wearing jeans. So that would slightly put me off. Yes, it's got e-lockout, but who wants to go through all of that? It's ridiculous just to get a lockout. So the question is, which one's better? I would argue that possibly on balance, if you're willing to put up with the micro USB, this is better. If you want the more modern interface and a lot more lumens and you don't wear tight jeans, this is better. But I'll leave that up to you, and enough of me waffling. I'm not going to give them a mark, because what you can do is, in the description you can go to a review of the Nightcore TIKI. I've got the Nightcore TIKI Glow in the Dark also, and the Jetbeam Mini one. They're all reviewed on the channel. Get yourself and see what I've said, and I've gone fine detail and in depth to explain all the differences in the lights here. So what I'm going to do is, yes, I've done loads of shots of that and loads of shots of that in their sort of reviews. However, what I want to do is I want to go out and get as many shots as I can in different sort of environments of these working together or in a similar situation, so you can look and go, well, that looks a bit better, or that looks better. Because let's be honest, when you've got an EDC keychain, it's what you're going to be looking at. Yes, the function's important and form's important, but how does it look to the human eye? And do you look at that and think, well, that looks better, better, or I don't like the looks of that. So I'm going to let you decide by watching the beam shot. So enough of me waffling, you've had enough of me, and I've tried to keep this short, so I'm going to get outside, so goodbye.